The term climate refugee was coined in the 1980s, and since then it has been getting closer to the global north. 20 years ago, the government of the islands of Tuvalu made headlines with political conferences held underwater. With the war in Syria, debates about climate exodus moved to the European borders, and they arrived with hurricanes, forest fires, and floods in the global north. Climate refugees are no longer people on a remote island in the global south. But who are they? In a maximum position, most refugees and displaced persons could be described as climate refugees, as a lot of conflicts and wars are influenced by the climate crisis. In a minimum position, on the other hand, it is not even clear whether climate refugees do exist at all. Most people who flee out of devastated environments never cross borders, and those who do often have multiple reasons to flee. That's why the estimates of how many climate refugees there are, and above all will be, vary wildly and range from 150 million to 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. In this video I will outline two interpretations of the figure of the climate refugee, a racist and a solidaric version. Let's start with the racist one. As New Orleans was flooded and destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, the storm primarily hit black residents because of the poverty and lack of infrastructure in their quarters. As they tried to flee from their homes into white neighborhoods, some were shot on bridges and open streets by police and white gangs. In these events, a kind of racism took shape that I will call climate racism. It has two dimensions. The first is structural and can be understood in terms of privilege. Who is hit by the effects of climate disaster? In the case of New Orleans, black and poor people were hit harder than white and rich people because the infrastructures of dams, health, insurances, mobility, water, food, housing was worse in these lower areas of the city. Structural racist violence comes in an indirect, slow, and often invisible form. On a global scale, this slow violence is made visible by the climate justice movements. Upper classes and people in the countries of the global north have caused most of the pollution, but people in the global south suffer the most from the effects of climate disaster. This structural dimension of climate racism is backed by open violence and white supremacy. The black climate refugees from New Orleans were seen by police and white gangs as menacing masses of criminals and plunderers. Their shooting were backed by conspiracy theories of reverse colonization that are called white genocide, Umvolkung, or grand replacement. These racist theories depict climate refugees as masses of Muslim and black populations that storm the borders of the global north and who are welcomed there by capitalist elites, which means in a cryptic way Jews, and adds to the theory an anti-Semitic layer. In a twist of cause and effect, climate refugees are depicted as waves. The problem then is no longer the climate crisis, the storms and real waves, but the cultural wars between North and South, black and white, Christianity and Islam, good and bad. In this context, the prognosis of future masses of climate refugees mirrors white anxieties of loss of control, of ungovernability, and all they have their roots in the colonist fears of rebellions of the enslaved. But the racist interpretation of menacing masses is not the only way to interpret climate refugees. In the narrative of climate justice, climate refugees are a political movement for global justice. Fleeing itself can be seen as a kind of political action. Climate refugees are part of political movements that fight for their right to the future. For radical solidaric, and that means transnational and intersectional movements, the climate refugee is one of the paradigmatic figures of the 21st century. Their flight links the rural regions and the cities. They link the global south and the global north, the poor and the rich, the young and the old, black and white. Climate refugees show that the ecological catastrophe is not just a pile of single exceptions and states of emergencies, but an ongoing disaster with long durations and roots in colonialism and imperialism and capitalism. Whereas a lot of discourse on climate is about future menaces, climate refugees already experience the end of the world. They flee out of collapsing states and infrastructures, out of desertification and floods, from storms and civil war. But instead of giving up, they decide to fight. Continuing the status quo is a death sentence to millions of people in the near future and billions of people in medium term. Climate racism is one option. It is easy to imagine a further fortification of borders, intensification of inequality and violence, destruction of the habitable world. It is easy to prognose a world of borders, apartheid, behind which the super rich and a small middle class thrive, and masses of people outside are left to die. But it's also possible to scale up the anti-racist, queer feminist and ecological movements of the last decade and imagine the radical solidaric words they are already prefiguring. The claim for climate justice is also the claim of the refugee movement for the right to move and the right to stay. It is part of the anti-racist claim of Black Lives Matter and is part of the critique of the violence against women and the expropriation of indigenous people. It is a claim by the futureless who fight for their right to live. The claim for climate justice is a solidaric claim for survival and for a revolution for life itself.